Tassin Baltimore and WNST.net. In my Dear Orioles series, I am trying to sort of span the baseball globe here, not just get some sort of, insulated opinion within the Beltway or around the Orioles or even around both Beltways, having spent some time down in D.C. now and seeing the Nationals and the backside of the Capitals parade. This guy gets East Coast, West Coast. He's been doing it longer than anybody I know, covering baseball inside the New York scene and then out on the West Coast for Major League Baseball and MLB.com. Now, a contributing national baseball columnist at Forbes. He is my friend. He's also a cancer survivor and writes about those kinds of issues as well. You can follow him out on Twitter at Boomski. That's Boomskie, along with a wonderful picture of him and Tony Gwynn. We welcome Barry Bloom back onto the program. Barry, it's tough times here in Baltimore, man. I know you've spent a lot of time in Baltimore in your time back on 33rd Street and through the modern era Camden Yards, and you have great reverence for all things that the Orioles represent as a brand. Boy, this is where the boat has hit the rocks, and I don't know what's going to pick it up, but we're certainly going to be talking about it here on a day-by-day basis, and it's a pretty significant 6-month period of time here for this organization.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that, there's going to be another transition in upper management, and how that's going to affect Buck Showalter and the field is anybody's guess at this point. They just had a really nice window there with a lot of talent to win, and they just didn't do it, which is, the downside sometimes of, clubs like the Orioles that don't have infinite amounts of money to spend.
Well, I mean, the Royals are going through that, but there's a whole different vibe there, right? They won. They had a parade. I think it's different in the aftermath of that, and I'm trying to add all that up. I've covered the Caps the last 2 months, running around from Vegas down to Tampa with them winning a championship and seeing what happens after that happens. But only, a handful of teams get to do that in any era, any generation, and there's more times than not where you're breaking up the band after having not won. The Orioles are that right now, and it's sticky all the way around, starting with the owner. So, if I'm doing my Dear Orioles letters here over the next 6 weeks, the first letter has to go to Mr. Angelos and to John Angelos and Lou Angelos, and maybe even to Rob Manfred, saying, who's going to be running this team? Who will be the decision maker or makers? In the case of Washington, the Lerner family, turned over the reins last week at the meetings from Ted Lerner, 92 years old, to Mark Lerner, who will be running it now. None of that's been transparent here, Barry, for, quite frankly, a quarter of a century.
Yeah, well, obviously, Ted Lerner is 92 years old, and Angelos is getting up there at this point, too. And, all those things have a determinative effect on the future running of the ball club. But I think, in the Orioles situation, the difference between the Orioles and the Nationals, that when the Nationals moved from Montreal and MLB ownership into D.C., and the new era, and they were ultimately sold to the Lerners after a couple of years in D.C. and into the new ballpark, they had a number of draft picks that they could use to build and reshape the ball club. And they did it by, Mike Rizzo taking Strasburg and Harper and Rendon, Zimmerman. I mean, you go down the list. This is the building blocks of the Nationals, and aside for, some of the younger players that the Orioles had back years ago, you haven't had that kind of effective drafting in the last couple of years. And I just wrote a column about this. The draft is such a crapshoot, and my example of it was, 25 teams or 24 teams passed on Mike Trout, and the Angels drafted him with the 25th pick. In fact, they had the 24th pick and picked somebody else before they picked Trout. So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take advantage of your first-round picks unless they're high picks. But you can always get plums. Giants got, Joe Panic pretty low in the first round. The Yankees got Judge with the 32nd pick. I mean, it's just a matter of how well your scouting is and what your luck is when you take some of these guys. And the Orioles, whatever they do in the next round, they've got to get into the realm of where, the Rizzos and Theo Epstein and Luno down in Houston, they took advantage in the low period of times with great draft picks that built towards the future, the championship teams. And then they built around those guys with free agent signings.
In the case of the Orioles, we're still seeing the remnants of McPhail being really, really good at picking baseball players. To your point, it is an art form, much more than a science, and as much as they make it out to be with sabermetrics and trying to translate, a college player, certainly a high school player, into the big leagues in 3 to 5 years, and a lot of clubs don't have the patience for that or the time to put in for that. And in the case of the Orioles, they have not scouted the international market at all. They've given away all their international signing bonus money. They have not had a good strategy at how to build a winner, quite frankly.
Well, that's that's the analysis right there. That's why they're in a situation now where, in particular, I think we had this conversation 2 years ago when they were still fairly competitive, but their pitching staff had gone south, either with injuries or underperformance. And they went out into the free agent market or into the trade market that year, and they were looking to pick up pitching to substantiate their pitching staff for a run at the division title that year, and they just never did it. And then they went into off seasons and never did it, or if they did, they picked up retreads, guys who have been around the league and just didn't really respond to them and respond well there. I mean, their baseball decisions over the course of the last few years and the limited way in which they were able to do it, I mean, I think they strung Duquette to a certain degree. And I think, you're in a situation there where, Duquette and Showalter didn't particularly get along, but he was told by Angelos that they had to get along. And ultimately, when you have that kind of schism in baseball these days, if you don't have everybody on the same page from top to bottom, you're just not going to do well on the field. I mean, the days of, the combustible George Steinbrenner type ownerships where a lot of good came out of chaos, as did in the 70s and early 80s Yankees, that's over. I mean, you have to have everybody on the same page. So whatever they do, they have to have everybody on the same page, top to bottom, heading into the next generation, or else it's just going to be the same thing.
Barry Bloom is our guest. He's with Forbes. He is Boom Ski out on Twitter as well. Has been covering baseball long enough to know right from wrong and good from bad, and certainly the scouting part of this, and I know you've spent a large segment of your life around scouts and behind home plate and the jugs guns and talking to those guys. There really is a part of that where they're not all created the same, right? And that talent evaluation, in addition to ownership that readily signs players, a good environment for them throughout the minor league system to sort of water them and bring them along, the right sort of training, the right sort of instruction for sure, and the pat on the back to get these kids through. That is so underappreciated when that you do hit it big. When your organization finds a Manny Machado, even if they draft him and he's closer to being in the big leagues and has all these great tools, but moving along players and making players better is something some organizations have been better at than others.
Well, I think the whole minor league system in baseball is pretty arcane. I mean, essentially, if you look at any year's draft, like say, look at last year's draft, you look at the players who came out of that draft, unless you have, some sort of stud who was a non-miss and gets picked near the top. Essentially, you're looking at 4 or 5 years for development of players in baseball, and no matter what their credentials were coming out of high school and college, you just don't know how that's going to be translated or nurtured in the minor leagues. And the minor leagues is kind of a wasteland where you still travel by buses. There's bad medical. There's bad
diet, bad fields. It's all of it's tough, right?
Yeah.
Literally.
Also dietary. I mean, it goes down the whole list that the products that the people that you have down there And you have very few who you look at and say, these are development prospects. They're essentially surrounded by people who are not going to make it to the major leagues, but they're just there to fill out rosters. And that's not saying that everybody doesn't have hope that they're going to do it, but the reality of it, it's a very small amount. It's like a thimble. So the question is, how do you develop those players and how do you set up the environment for them to emerge out of the minor leagues, to get to the major leagues? And, as far as the scouting component is concerned, yeah, of course, every scout has a different bias, different, set of skills. I think where metrics come in, it's very important at this point to use as a tool. I mean, anything that you can use to prognosticate future performance based on the past is good, because there's no way. It doesn't matter, what numbers say. It doesn't matter at some points what your eyes may tell you, because you just don't know from level to level how a kid is going to grow. And then finally, after the long period of development, unless the kid has really special tools, gets to the major leagues, and how that's going to translate against, as a hitter, major league against major league pitching, and vice versa as a pitcher against major league hitting. And those guys, even who start off great, with a spark and adjustments, to that guy, then you see what they're made of over the course of the long term.
Well, we're seeing that with Jonathan Scope this year. I mean, last year he's a $100 million player. This year he's hitting 210. I mean, Machado was hitting 210 this time last year, and now the Orioles expect the King's ransom for him. I mean, it is a stock market to some degree, and these are human beings, and injuries happen, and all sorts of distractions and issues happen. But, by and large, Machado is a guy that's going to go out. Someone's going to give him $300 million. It's not going to be the Orioles. And now, over the next 5-6 weeks, we're going to sit here and see where the bids are on him, and that's going to be the biggest story to really surface from this organization this summer, at least.
Right, except I'm not sure in this marketplace, and you saw what happened in the free agent marketplace last winter, I'm not sure that any team is going to be willing to give the Orioles the amount of prospects they may want to trade Machado by July 30th. I mean, they might, or July 31st. I mean, they may very well say, we'll just give them, we'll just give them a qualifying offer at the end of the season, and then we'll take the tweener draft pick next year in an unknown capacity of what we're going to get, and just play them out for the rest of the year, because I don't see any team giving them high-level prospects for Machado for a 2-month rental. And then you look at what's the universe of teams out there right now that really needs Machado. Well, I mean, the American League, and it's probably something we would have talked about a little later in a different question. But if you look at both leagues right now, the American League, it's over. I mean, there are 5 teams that essentially have positioned themselves for either division title or a playoff spot. So, in the American League East, one of the wild card teams is going to be the Yankees or the Red Sox, and one's going to win the division. In the West, it's Houston probably, and they're off on a tremendous run again right now, or Seattle, and more likely that Seattle's going to be the number 2 wild card spot. And in the Central, there's only one decent team, and that's the Indians. So there you are. So none of those teams need Machado. They're not going out to get Machado. And then you go to the National League, and the National League is wide open because there's not really a decent team in the whole National League. One team will emerge, but I mean, when you look at the team with the best prospects of doing something, and probably the best talent from top to bottom in the Nationals, they're not even in first place right now in their own division. So, I mean, the Cubs are dangerous as always. Milwaukee's having a really good year. The West is wide open because every team has been killed with injuries. And so... but
suddenly the Dodgers are like a factor. Like the Dodgers could use Machado, right?
They could, but they're a team that, and this is where you go into the business of baseball. because of the competitive balance tax structure and how the Players Association allowed this to get there. I'm not sure.
They used to be more shrewd than this, by the way, right?
Yeah, they were snookered into the fact that the Dodgers being not only over the tax threshold of $197 million, were paying the 50% repeater tax, but it being $40 million above 197, they were paying another 45% on top of that. So essentially, you're paying a 95% tax on every free agent contract that you're signing. And so what the Dodgers did was they said, no, enough's enough. And there were debt service issues on the club. They basically, like the Giants and the Yankees, ducked under the threshold. The only team that has remained over the threshold right now, and it's also perilously close to the 95% tax, is the Red Sox, who are far and away have the highest payroll in the league. But your usual culprits are not there this year, and they're not going there. And I don't think the Dodgers are going there, and they're not signing a Machado long term. They can't afford to. But they have enough talent in their organization, from top to bottom. If you're looking at it, it was April. They had a bad April. A lot of it was injuries. A lot of it was the hangover from losing the World Series in the last game last year on their own field. A lot of it's veteran players, basically revving it up again. But, now, even without Kershaw and a more modest starting rotation, they've had enough guys coming up through the system that they're competitive in a division where the Giants and Diamondbacks have also been banged up like crazy all season. And the Diamondbacks, despite the loss of a lot of guys, have really hung in there. And they're still in first place, despite a horrendous May. So, the Dodgers would rise. And they have Turner at third base. And their Seager is going to come back next year. They don't need Machado.
Barry Bloom joining us here. He is Boom Ski out of Forbes and out on Twitter. I'm sorry, Barry, to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you're fine. It was the end of it.
It's never the end of it for the Orioles. And Machado, clearly Adam Jones, this is going to be a weird sort of uncomfortable thing for him as he enters the end of this. And guys who do what he does don't get 5-year, $80 million deals anymore based on what we saw last offseason. You've got Brock, you've got Britton. Britton's been hurt. They're trying to get some value out of him. And then you have Buck and Dan Duquette. That there's going to be a real shakeup here as Brady Anderson has started to make decisions, including the one to give Alex Cobb all that money late in spring training, as well as bring Cashner in. At this point, a clear path and some sort of clear strategy will be drawn up one way or another through these decisions. We saw that Ned Colletti was linked to the job last week, but this is going to be a strange, uncomfortable summer as the Orioles lose 100 games here, Barry.
Yeah, and I'm not sure in this era, Ned is a good friend of mine, and I think he's very good. But I don't know that in this day and age and era that's the direction you really want to go. You might as well keep Duquette at that point. It's like you need to get into the younger realm of the more, 30 to 40-year-old hotshot guys who have been assistants somewhere and have building, guys like Josh Stein in San Diego have been an assistant general manager. I think he's been an assistant. He was an intern with my son in the Padre organization. And he's been there through KT, Josh Burns, Jed Hoyer, now, with AJ Preller. And he's a guy who's got a cornucopia of experience who could really wind up, I think, very well running a team. Those are the guys you have to start looking at now. You can't be going back to the past and picking up guys who were general managers and are 60 years old. It's not the place to go. So if the Orioles don't start there, the Orioles are headed for a world of pain.
Well, can they attract a real candidate, Barry? That really was the issue with Duquette.
Yes, of course they can attract a real candidate. There are only 30 of these jobs in Major League Baseball. And it doesn't matter, what the Orioles' track record is, or what you have to do to deal with Angelos or in the family and their superstructure, because there's always going to be a good young guy who's going to come in and say, "I'm not taking this job unless you do A, B, C," like Mike Hazen did here in Arizona. Kendrick and Derek Hall, Ken Kendrick being their managing general partner, they've been intrusive on baseball operations for years, telling them what to do, what not to do. And Hazen came in when they took him from the Red Sox, and basically one of the criteria of him taking the job was, "You're going to let me do my job. I've got a 5-year contract. Let me do my job. Don't interfere." And Kendrick said, "Okay, evidently what I've been doing hasn't worked." They've had up-team general managers, up-team managers. It's a situation that had to be corrected. And he came in, brought Torey Lovullo with him, and you've seen the success they've had already in what's coming up to a year and a half, because management gets out. And that's what the Orioles are going to have to do. They're going to have to hire a good hotshot, get out, and leave the guy alone, and let that guy bring in a manager, tried or untried. It doesn't matter anymore. People bring in managers. Nobody wants to pay managers the type of money the last generation of managers were making anyway. So they'd rather replace Joe Girardi with Aaron Boone, a guy with no experience.
Well, and Kapler would be the same situation in Philadelphia, right?
Kapler, Alex Cora, who at least had a lot of bench experience, down in Houston under A.J. Hedge. But these are all guys with no Major League Baseball experience. And even Lovullo was a bench coach for 6 years under Farrell in Toronto and Boston, and he had no Major League Manager experience either. And Dave Roberts had no Major League Manager experience when he went to the Dodgers. There are plenty of these guys out there to try and see how they integrate, because they're also, willing to work with a general manager who builds an analytics staff around him and passes that information, on constantly to the field. And it gives you more of a chance to win. So, that's where the Orioles have to go. Because that's where baseball has gone. And you can't do it in the old, Kevin Towers or, Dan Duquette way anymore, because they're not versed in that language.
Barry Bloom is here. He's versed in all sorts of languages. He is a young old-timer and covering Major League Baseball on the East Coast and in and around the Yankees for many, many years. Now out on the West Coast working for Forbes after a stint at MLB.com. You can find him at Boomski. That's Boomskie. Anything you want to say on the Chris Davis contract and where that is, and of all the horrific contracts? I remember when the Matt Youngs were signing deals 30 years ago and stiffing teams for $5 and $10 and $20 million, and we were all aghast. And obviously here, the Albert Bell signing, Mr. Angelos wound up getting a good, nice $50 million chunk of that back in insurance money. But they feel like they're on the hook for Chris Davis. He's not a Major League player anymore. He hasn't been a Major League player in over a year. They've now given him sort of a little bit of a corporate timeout and sending him away a little bit to try to fix him up or whatever. He's owed over $130 million still, Barry. It's an amazing story of what not to do, and also an amazing story about a player who can't find himself right now.
Well, unfortunately, because of the salary structure and guaranteed contracts in Major League Baseball, there are Chris Davis type stories everywhere in baseball. Right now, the Red Sox, with a $232 million payroll, are paying $55 million to guys who are no longer on the team this year. Hanley Ramirez, that they recently released, Pablo Sandoval, who's playing with the Giants for the minimum, and the Red Sox are paying him to play there, and Rusney Castillo. So, and the Dodgers, for a number of years, have been paying up in that level. They played Carl Crawford. It was the same situation as Davis with Carl Crawford. they took on his contract in the deal to get Adrian Gonzalez, and essentially wound up getting almost nothing out of Crawford and releasing him at the end and paying him something like $21 million per season. And that contract, I think, just ended at the end of last season. So, I mean, there are a lot of these contracts out there where, you're paying people on past performance and especially value to the organization, which a guy like Davis had. He had value to the fan base, value to the organization. They had to make a decision at that point. If I remember correctly, Davis didn't have much of any offers anywhere else. And essentially the Orioles were bidding against themselves. But here's what's happened in Major League Baseball. And it's funny you call me the young old,
young old timer. That was a John Stedman line, Barry, just so you know. And I knew you know Stedman. Stedman would always refer to folks as young old timers. Yes.
Right. And I think that's applicable because, I understand the evolution of the whole system and why it works now. And what really happened in the last free agent market was that your analytics guys who are basically producing the programs which tell you who you should draft, who you should keep, who you should hone in on, they basically run these programs on free agents now too. And they tell the owner, you can't give this guy more than like 2 years, X amount of dollars. So the emotional response of the Angeloses and the Steinbrenners and Reinsdorf, the old timers have been in the game for a long time, basically were to whatever they were told, there was an emotional response to signing a player. And so they overrode the reality and signed that player because of an emotional response, not based on the reality of the fact that what does this guy have left and how much are we giving away for him for past performance. I mean, you're always paying, especially a free agent and an older one, you're always paying them based on your past performance. The Angels are in that situation right now with Albert Pujols. I mean, they've got like 4 years to go on a contract with Albert that's higher paid as it goes on. I mean, they're going to be paying Albert something like $32 million a year for 3 or 4 years, and his good days are clearly behind him. And so it's a diminished response, but they decided to sign him for 10 years at the time they did. And I think full knowing that as you get further along on that contract, the part of doing business was you're going to be paying for either a guy who has diminished performance on the field or even can't play anymore.
But he still drove in 100 runs last year, 120 the year before. He's going to hit you 250, 260, not going to be a 340 hitter anymore. Chris Davis should never be in a lineup again. That's a whole different level of paying too much for.
You'll get to that point with Albert at some point too. And so they're going to be at the position where they're going to be paying Albert to do nothing anymore. And that's the price you pay in the way the market is assembled in Major League Baseball.
Wow, the numbers are unbelievable.
The only way you change it is by what the owners did last year and saying, we're really not going to pay that kind of money anymore. And when Scott Burrows went out and said, we want 7 years, $200 million for J.D. Martinez, the Red Sox said, we're willing to pay him $110 or so, and that's it. And that's the contract he wound up taking. And it's not undervalued for J.D. Martinez. But that's where you're going, based on analytics and based on sanity, that's where you're going in Major League Baseball.
Yeah, the Angels owe Pujols $87 million after this year, and he's getting $27 this year. So, yeah, it's still hovering about $120 right now that they owe him all in for ordinary production. Barry Bloom is our guest. He is from Forbes, longtime Major League Baseball insider. Also, Boomski, that's Boomskie, out on Twitter. I guess last thing for you, you've been running around with Ohtani. You mentioned the Angels, and you're out on the West Coast with all these stories. He's been a sensational story. I mean, here in Baltimore, we're so sort of moribund on baseball that even the good stories aren't making their way here because we don't think the Yankees and the Red Sox are good stories in Baltimore. Certainly the Ohtani thing was a wild, story, literally a unique story. We don't get a lot of those in baseball.
Yeah, and it's at the point now where it's essentially about to be over, because sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks, they're going to have to make a decision on whether his elbow is strong enough to pitch anymore this year, or he's going to need, Tommy John surgery, which is going to put him out until 2020. And if, in fact, that does happen, then, he's going to be an ordinary guy coming back, rehabbing, just like anybody else. And this sensational story of this two-way player coming over from Japan is essentially over. The other option they may have, and this is totally my opinion, is that they could bring him back just to hit for the rest of the year, shut him down as a pitcher, which is really what the Fighters did last year in Japan. I mean, last year he pitched 25 innings, but he had over 200 some odd at bats, and he had a series of injuries, an ankle injury, a hamstring injury, and then obviously near the end he was starting to have elbow problems because, at the end of the season he had one of these, plasma-enriched shots in his elbow, and he was diagnosed with a grade 1 sprain of the UCL, and everybody in the major leagues knew this and still bid for him. And under the new international rules, where he came over as an under 25, the biggest payment the Angels had to make on it was the $20 million they had to pay the fighter as a posting fee to sign him. But otherwise, they paid him a $2.3 million bonus and the minimum salary, and they have him for 6 years, and so they've got time to see how this evolves. But I think the point of the matter is he's never going to be a great full-time pitcher and hitter in Major League Baseball. He's not Babe Ruth. So, I mean, that was a fun story for a while, and especially in April after he had a lousy spring. And now I understand why they slow-walked him on the mound in the spring. He accelerated in April and had a tremendous month both on the mound and at the plate. And then May, everything started to fall apart. And that's where we are right now with him. It's sad because he's a great kid, and it was a great story and a unique one that, many people around the world were paying close attention to, particularly in Japan. And I'm sorry to see it have come to where it is at this point. But that's the reality of the situation.
Do you really think the Orioles aren't going to be able to deal Machado? Is that your prediction that I call you August 1st and he's still an Oriole?
Unless they take marginal prospects for him, they're not going to get the high-level prospects for Machado that they're going to want to trade him. So, I mean, if I'm them, I sit there going, I'd rather take the unknown of another first-round pick next year than, like the garbage that some organization is going to give them just to pick up Machado as a 2-month rental. And like I said, the universe of teams that need him, there's really none right now in the American League. And in the National League, could the Cubs use him at shortstop? Not really. I mean, they've got Addison Russell. What do they need him at shortstop for? They've got Bryant at third base. The Dodgers we just talked about. The Giants, I don't think have even the prospects in their system anymore because everybody that has needed to come up through their system has played in the major leagues with all the injuries they've had the last couple of years. So, and who knows? Maybe the Diamondbacks give up on Jake Lamb because he can't hit left-handed pitching and say, we'd rather have Machado, but Machado wants to play short. He doesn't want to play third base. So, I mean, I'd love to see Machado finish the season as a 2-month rental. He'd be their J.D. Martinez of this year, and you take Machado in there, get a run out of them to, go for the division title and deeper into the playoffs this year, and then let him go to somebody who's going to pay him big money, just like they did with J.D. Martinez this year. I mean, that's certainly probably the greatest possibility. But again, they don't really have the top range prospects in the minor league system anymore either. They've got everybody who they've needed, especially with their pitching injuries, has been to the major leagues. So their minor leagues are kind of like, even AAA, AA. They don't even have the long-range prospects at this point that the Orioles might want. So, I mean, that's a decision the Orioles have to make. They have to decide, do we let this guy go for mid-range and lower prospects that may not even develop and go to a major league team and just part ways with him now? Or do we let him play out the season here and take the tweener pick that they're going to get next year in the draft?
Well, you always remember the names you get when you deal off those kinds of players. I mean, we go back, I guess far enough here and remembering the Glenn Davis deal and, dealing away the Kurt Schillings and the Pete Harnishes and the guys that have been involved in the organization over the period of time. Juan Bell and the Eddie Murray deal, Manny Alexander that came our way, and we thought he was going to take Cal Ripken's spot. You remember the failed guys, but certainly whatever 2 or 3 names they would get back from Machado, the fans here would all think they got to get to the big leagues and make it. I'm with you. I think it's a very, very difficult proposition they have coming up over the next couple of weeks in dealing these players. I think they have a lot of difficult decisions to make, and that's why I'm writing about it and watching World Cup and talking baseball with you, because it has been a difficult summer around here to watch the Orioles, Barry. But I'll check back in with you later on in the summer around a trading deadline. We'll see how it goes. Always great to visit with you, my friend. Enjoy the sun out there on the West Coast.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's always great to be on with you too, Nestor.
You got it. Barry Bloom, he's out with Forbes. He does all the baseball work there, along with my pal Maury Brown and some others. You can find him at Forbes.com. You can also find him out on Twitter at Boomski. That's Boomskie out on Twitter. You can find me in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. By downloading the TuneIn Radio app, we do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Our morning newspaper ships digitally to your email inbox free of charge at 7 a.m. every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life, guaranteed. Also, the Maryland Jockey Club and the Laurel entries for the weekend, all in the WNST morning newspaper, as well as out on the front of WNST.net. Any breaking news? If the Orioles do deal Manny Machado, you'll get it first on the WNST text service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard, and Dennis will be here on Thursday, driving you home, getting you ready for the weekend. I'm watching a lot of World Cup. Trying to enjoy myself, visiting lots of sponsors. We'll be out at Costas Inn on Thursday night, eating crabs, drinking beer, watching the NBA draft, and giving away the Free the Bird shirts that I am modeling here while supplies last. I'll be there around 7:30, and looking forward to seeing Pete, Nick, and all the folks over at Costas. It's been a little while since I've cracked some crabs over there, so it'll be fun. See you on Thursday night. Free the Birds shirts. In limited sizes, in limited quantity. They're 12 years old. They've been sitting in a box. So I'm bringing them out. We'll see how it goes. I am Nestor. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.